What is up, folks? How are y'all guys doing? Tristan here, Ingram Orchids and More. We hadn't had a video in a while, and I apologize about that. I've been kind of busy lately. But today I want to talk a little bit about fertilizing. Spring is, in my opinion, one of the more important times to be thinking about fertilizer, and not only thinking about it, but applying it. I want to give you all just some of my thoughts and my opinions, and they are just that. They are my thoughts and my opinions. You know, I do work professionally with orchids, but this is still, you know, this is just my philosophy, and I can share with y'all my experiences and what I can tell y'all about what I do. And each of you are going to need to come to your own conclusions about fertilizer, nutrition, and make your own decisions, you know, that you're happy with. Why am I saying that? Because there are a lot of people who, you know, there's a lot of different opinions out there. There's a lot of different research, there's a lot of good and a lot of different evidence about what and how much fertilizer orchids need. So most of what we grow here are epiphytic orchids, which means, you know, they would naturally, even the hybrid ones, they would they grow in such a way like the wild species. They would grow upon trees or, you know, on rock faces. Those are technically lithophytes. But most of this stuff grows on other plants, you know, usually trees. And being so, a lot of these are subtropical or tropical, and they grow naturally where there's going to be very little nutrients. And I say that with an asterisk next to it. So most of these plants are growing in the treetops and the canopies, and they're subjected to the frequent rainfall. So a lot of these are going to have you know, a lot of rain, especially if they're growing somewhere that has a monsoon season. So a lot of times these epiphytic orchids, they're not going to be, you know, they're not going to have immediate access to a lot of constant nutrition in the way of the big three: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And we'll talk about the minors in a minute too. That being said, well, and you ask, why are they not? Because, you know, they are on the bark of a tree, and they're getting what dust accumulates, what organic material runs down the trees into the root zone, be it, you know, just dust deposits, decaying organic material, maybe bird droppings, stuff like that. So you wouldn't think that'd be a whole lot of a nutritional, whole lot of nutrients available to the plant. And when they are available, they are sparse and sporadic. But another thing I want to say is most orchids, in fact all orchids, start off their life being either mutualistic with or parasitic with some sort of mycorrhizal fungus. And a lot of times these mycorrhizal fungus, they do all the work for the orchid during the first few years of its life. And some orchids, they do all the work for the orchid its entire life. And that being said, these mycorrhizal fungi are supplying, you know, all the nutrients the plant needs during the first couple years, because the plant's not big enough to start photosynthesizing efficiently, or with the parasitic orchids, not at all. And in that case, they're kind of getting their nutrients sideways, so they're not maybe directly absorbing a lot of nutrients via their root system that would, you know, accumulate in the normal fashion. They are kind of, you know, tapping into what their associated mycorrhizal fungi can provide. But that is neither here nor there, because most of us are growing for hobby, and we do not have access to some of those mycorrhizal fungi. Some of us do. You know, there are some orchids that, like here we have butterfly orchids, and they occur naturally, and so you can get those pop up on your trees. And we've made videos about some of our volunteer orchids, and that is because there is some sort of beneficial mycorrhizal fungi present and available here on some of our trees. But for the most of the potted and mounted orchids that are on pieces of wood or just free hanging, they are only getting what Mother Nature or we give them. Most of these orchids do a lot of their growing in the spring and summertime. And so what you need to think about is, when do these plants need the most nutrition? That's when they're putting on the most biomass, putting out the most new growth. And you need to think about when they're flowering too, when their flowering season in, because flowering and new growth takes up a lot of a lot of nutrients, and the big three are, in order of priority: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Nitrogen is what makes plants grow. Without being too technical about it, you got to have nitrogen to produce new green growth. Phosphorus and potassium are, also needed quite heavily, and they help with root development, flower development, and cellular division on the micro scale. But they also need things like calcium and magnesium. So there's a lot of different studies. I'm not going to mention any that, and a lot of it may be outdated, but from my understanding, a lot of orchids tend to be, if they're not fertilized frequently, they tend to be deficient in calcium and magnesium. And that's why orchid growers and epiphytic tropical plant growers tend to talk so much about CalMag, which is just a calcium and magnesium supplement. They tend to talk about that so much because we're worried about our orchids or our nice tropical plants being deficient in those nutrients. So without further ado, I want to talk to you about some of the things that I use. I'm not talking about what I use at work. That's neither here nor there, but a lot of my experiences from work I bring to my own personal growth or my own personal plant collection, and I try to implement some of those same strategies, and I'd like to share them with you. Usually we try in the spring and summer to fertilize weekly or every other week, I should say, sorry. And what I'm usually using is a water-soluble orchid fertilizer. It is tailored for orchids, but it can be used for other stuff, that has those minors in abundance, such as the calcium and the magnesium. Orchids also need a little bit of iron. They may need a little bit of manganese. Most of these minors are exactly that. They're minor elements. They don't need to be in high concentrations, but they're there because they do have some need of it. And so without further ado, I'd like to show you what I use. Is Palmer Orchid Special CalMag with seaweed extract. And so you're gonna be like, well, what's with the seaweed? We'll talk about that in a minute. This is a general water-soluble orchid fertilizer that has calcium and magnesium added. It's also got some seaweed extract. And most people are gonna be talking about numbers when they talk about fertilizer, because that's what's important. And so these numbers are ratios of, the percent of these nutrients in the product by weight or volume. And so you're always going to have a guaranteed analysis. You want to go over there and look at that. So for the Palmer Orchids Special with the CalMag, I don't know if y'all can see that. This is nitrogen. We have nitrogen in 14%. Most of this nitrate comes up from nitrate nitrogen. There's a little bit of ammonia-based nitrogen. 2% of it is ammonia-based. We come down to our next one, which is phosphorus, and that we have 2%. And so that's going to be pretty low because we don't need a whole lot of phosphorus. Generally for growing orchids, you want a little bit, but not a lot. Potassium. Potassium is another big one. So 14%, that's how much potassium is available. And next we have calcium. Calcium is pretty high in this, and that is at 5% compared to other fertilizers, which calcium is either not present or it's in a lower percentage. Magnesium, so 2%. So that's a pretty good magnesium concentration. We also have 0.02% boron, 0.05% copper, 0.25% iron, which is chelated, which means it becomes a little bit more bioavailable. Manganese, that's also chelated in 0.05%, a little bit of molybdenum, and a little tiny bit of zinc. So, what's the seaweed? He didn't talk about the seaweed. So seaweed is not technically a fertilizer, it is a supplement. It is from what is it based off? I forget the genus. It's a type of, it's kelp. Whatever the species, genus and species for kelp is, I forget. But people who grow a lot of plants use a lot of seaweed, or at least some of them do, because they contain a lot of auxins and hormones that, help root development, help, with extra growth and such. It's not fertilizing the orchid, but it's helping stimulate the growth. And in that case, you're hoping that you have the fertilizer nutrients available to the plant so that it can sustain that that increase in growth. And more specifically, where the seaweed, you're mostly trying to go after root development with the seaweed. It helps with other things too, but it is just that. It is a supplement, and if you are weary of that, you should do your own research. Don't just take my word for it. Do your own research about seaweed extracts or kelp extracts in fertilizer and come to some conclusions about how and if it's worth, you know, adding into your fertilizer or your plant nutrition regimen. But I think it is. In low concentrations, I think it is definitely worth it. And that brings me to our next thing. Oh, before I go on, I should tell you all this. I said it's water soluble. So this is a powder. So I got my little measuring spoons in here. So this is a water soluble powder. You mix this up, and the instructions are it's a teaspoon to a gallon of water. How you apply that: you either use it as a drench. Oh, that's gonna be loud. Make sure that lid's on. And notice how I have this in a bucket with a rubber sealed lid, because this stuff is like damper it. It pulls the water right out of the air because the fertilizers are salts, and it'll take all that water out of the air and it'll turn to soup. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So this would be applied in a gallon of water, or however many gallons you need. That's, you know, it's a teaspoon to a gallon for this particular one. And you either use a pump sprayer or you use a drench, like you just mix up how many gallons you need and you apply it by drenching the root system of the plant. Other one that we use, I don't use this one as much. This is Palmer Orchids special, the Root and Bloom. This also has the seaweed in it. Both of Palmer Orchids fertilizers both contain the seaweed. So the Root and Bloom is tailored more so for an infrequently used nutrition program, where you apply this intermittently. You apply, recommendation would be apply this frequently, this every now and then, and more so in the spring and summer. And you're noticing here, this has a high middle number, which is phosphorus. This is nitrogen 10%, phosphorus 35%, potassium 15%. And that middle number is higher because there's some evidence that shows that you're replacing your high nitrogen fertilizer with one that has a little bit more phosphorus can help when the plants are getting ready to start rooting and start blooming. They're going to need the phosphorus in a little bit higher abundance. But that being said, I don't use this one as much because it's not meant to be used as often. You want to have your nitrogen higher than your phosphorus most of the time. Occasionally you do need a little bit higher phosphorus than nitrogen, so you use this when plants are getting ready to start producing an abundance of roots or an abundance of flowers, which in most cases tends to be in spring and summer. This is also a teaspoon to gallon of water, used in the same exact manner. So here is something else. If you're like me and you're lazy and you're like, oh, I need to fertilize my plants, I just don't want to do it today. A lot of people like to use some form of slow released granular fertilizer, and I just so happen to really like this brand, Dynamite. You get this at Walmart, Home Depot, Lowe's, any place like that. They sell it like everywhere. This is flower and vegetable 13 13 13. So this one has even numbers all across the board. So it's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are all in the same ratios. Let's see what else it has. It's got a little tiny bit of magnesium. It's actually got quite a bit of sulfur, which they do need some sulfur. It's got a little tiny bit of iron, a little bit of manganese. But notice, no calcium. A little bit of magnesium, but there's no calcium in here. So for orchids, you still are going to want to be using something that's got calcium in it, so that you're not missing out on that. And calcium is very important for orchids. So if you're going to use a slow release fertilizer on your orchids, and make sure you're still using something that has calcium in it. And this only really helps you if you're growing potted orchids. There are some people who have, for their hanging plants, made the little sachets, those little baggies that, you know, they got the holes all over them. I like their wedding favor bags or something like that. or the little plastic baskets that just hold it, and you attach it to your hanging plant above the root zone. So every time you water the plant, like a little bit just trickles down onto the roots. I don't do that. That's a lot of work. I don't want to do that. So I just make sure we're using our water soluble for all the orchids, but most importantly the hanging ones or mounted ones, because this works mostly just sprinkling a little bit into the top of the pot where the roots are. So every time you water the plant, a little bit of nutrients washes into the root zone. So I use that quite consistently on all my potted plants, and then I still, on top of that, make sure I'm using my water soluble general orchid fertilizer on top of it. If you don't have access to these two products, which I'm not just hounding on them because I work there, but I do think this is a great product, Palmer Orchids Fertilizer. But let's say you don't have it. You could always get something like Maxi Crop. They come in a liquid, it comes in a liquid form too, but this is just the seaweed powder by itself. You can add this into your fertilizer, or just use it by itself, applying it at a separate time. But what I found is you should be real careful with this. And so what I used to do was I would use my Palmer Orchids CalMag fertilizer, which has some in there, and I'd add a little bit more of this. But what I found was that my electrical conductivity in TDS, or total dissolved solids, after adding this and the CalMag fertilizer to my water, it was way too high for the what is safe, or what is generally recognized as safe for orchids. So without getting too crazy, you want to make sure that your fertilizer is low concentration compared to other plants. That's why people oftentimes tell you use a quarter strength or half strength of a general purpose fertilizer if you're going to use that, because their fertilizers are very salty and they raise the total dissolved solid measurement and the electrical conductivity of the water when you mix them. And if those numbers are too high, what you can end up with is burnt root tips or burnt foliage if you go real high. But usually the first thing you'll notice if you over fertilize is burnt root tips. And you want to take good care of your root tips on your orchids, because if you can grow good roots, you can grow good orchids most of the time. And if you're using tap water like me, your municipal drinking water, most of the time that's pretty good water. It tends to have some chlorine amount in there. Some places have a higher chlorine amount than others, but my water here in Manatee County is it's pretty good water. It's not very high in chlorine, and I've tested the water and it's just slightly above 7 on the pH scale. So when I add the fertilizer to it, it brings the pH down to around 6, which is right around where you want it. And the TDS, using the label rate teaspoon per gallon of this, I get my electrical conductivity in TDS right about the maximum threshold of what's safe for the orchids. And that tends to be, I forget the TDS number, but the electrical conductivity number, you don't want it to be over 2 microvolts, or I think it's 2 microvolts per cubic centimeter or cubic liter of water. I forget what the unit of measurement there is. I'll have to add that in there. But you don't want it to be over 2, and usually don't want it to be over 1. But with people's water that they usually use, it tends to come out around somewhere around 1 to 2. If you start going above those numbers, you start burning roots. And I found when I mixed extra seaweed in with my CalMag, I was fertilizing with a solution that was a little bit hotter than what is generally safe. So you got to be careful about that. Last but not least, I want to talk about another calcium. You know, we've been talking about calcium a lot. This is calcium nitrate. This is just Southern Ag's product of calcium nitrate. You can get this from different brands, but if I'm not doing a regular fertilizer, sometimes I'll use calcium nitrate because orchids do seem to like a lot of calcium. The only thing about this product versus like a CalMag fertilizer, which has calcium magnesium, this is nitrogen too. So this, you're going to get your calcium and the nitrate. The nitrate imports quite a lot of nitrogen to the mix that will be available. And let's look up here. So total nitrogen is 15%, total calcium is 19%. So this is only like a half a teaspoon per gallon. I think I've used it at a teaspoon, but that's way more nitrogen, parts per million of nitrogen, than what is recommended for orchids. So be careful using this. If you do too much of that, you can burn your plants with that as well. So just read the label on the calcium nitrate. I think generally half a teaspoon per gallon is what you should use, and you don't mix this with anything else. If you're going to use calcium nitrate, that should be a standalone product in application, and for that matter, really any of these should. You don't mix your root and bloom in your regular fertilizer, and like I said, if you take the chances of mixing extra seaweed in with your fertilizer and you're not testing the solution to see what your TDS and electrical conductivity are, you might run into some burnt roots if you make it too salty. Don't overdo the slow release. So if you add too much of this in here, you could still burn your plants, because a lot of these can flash release their contents if the temperatures get too high, or after it's been in the elements for so long, they can start to rapidly release their nutrients. And I do like Dynamite brand because I find that it works better than Osmocote or NutriCoat or anything like that. I find you don't get as much burn in our hot Florida summers with this. So that's just my opinion though. I like that stuff. But this is the holy grail. This is what I'm using most of the time. I don't worry about burning plants with this stuff. It gives the plants almost everything they need. In fact, I would say there's everything in this product that your orchids would need, and if you use just this product here, you may not need anything else. So we talked about those issues with the water quality, and I want to touch on that real quick. So let's say you come over here to your tap water, or let's say you have well water. You want to make sure your water quality is pretty good. So if you're starting off with water that's really basic, let's say it has a pH above 7, and then you have, you know, your TDS is already of the water, let's say it's 600-700 parts per million or something really high, just being just water, that does not leave you a lot of room to add in nutrients via fertilizer, and doesn't leave you a lot of room to play around with those numbers, because then you're going to end up with a fertilizer solution that's, you know, it's too dangerous to spray. And I'm not saying that this is going to be most people's cases, because like I said, the tap water for most folks tends to be just fine. But if you're really worried about it, what you could do for your fertilizer applications is keep a bunch of distilled water or filtered rainwater or reverse osmosis water if you're lucky enough to have an RO machine. What you do not want to do is, I've heard some people tell me that they've killed their orchids because they started watering their orchids or with a water softened system. You do not want to use water softened water at all, and definitely nothing water softened with fertilizer, because water softeners, they add salt ions into the water, and you do not want sodium ions on your orchids. That is not something that you want. So that would be a no-no. But if you have well water, different places in Florida, I know most of y'all are not in Florida, but we're in here in Florida, so I'm going to talk about Florida. So most places in Florida have kind of alkaline water. We have a lot of calcium, and you know, there's a lot of limestone bedrock. Some places in Florida, their well water is like excellent. It's almost pure water, but it varies where in the state you are, and each well is different. So just if you're in doubt, just test your water. It's not that hard. You can test your water, take it somewhere, or you can get you some cheap meters just to test your water at home. Test the pH, test the TDS, test the EC or the electrical conductivity. And you should also test your well water and your tap water at different times, because depending on where your municipal drinking water facility is getting their water, different times of the year it might be a little bit different. So most of ours come from Lake Manatee, I believe, and that water, if they start off with water that's had a lot of runoff and stuff in there, and the water's just high in dissolved solids, it's harder for them to remove those contaminants, so to speak, even though there may not be contaminants. Those things that are in the water, the dissolved things that are in the water, it's harder for them to remove the total amount necessary. They meet drinking water standards. They don't worry as much about our plants. They just want to make sure it's safe for human consumption. Plant consumption is an afterthought. So just make sure your water quality is good, especially when you're mixing with fertilizer. How are we going to apply these products? So the first thing, for a lot of my potted plants, what I'll do is just, maybe this is a 2-gallon bucket, but I usually mix up a couple of 5-gallon buckets. I just set them on the ground there, fill them up with the amount of water and fertilizer, and then I just drench the potted plants with that. But the next thing you could use, which most people are going to be using, is a pump sprayer. This one's a little dirty, but it's been hiding down here. So get you a 1 or a 2-gallon pump sprayer that you use just for your orchid fertilizer. You don't want to be mixing your Roundup bottle with your orchid fertilizer. Even if you do clean it out, God forbid, you know, you leave a little bit of Roundup in the bottom of that and you go to fill up your thing with fertilizer and you're wondering, oh, why did all my plants dead? And you had forgot to rinse out what's left of your Roundup or your herbicide that was in the bottle. So get you a nice pump sprayer that's just for fertilizing your plants, and use that consistently, and you should still wash it out in between uses. So you can mix it up in here, or mix it up in your bucket and then pour it in there. It doesn't really matter. But just make sure it's well mixed before you start applying it, because most of these fertilizers, they need some agitation to get them dissolved all the way. The other thing you could do is say, to heck with that, get you a backpack sprayer. So I've had quite a lot of backpack sprayers. I even have, well, I have another one, the regular pump style one, but this year I got a Ryobi battery powered backpack sprayer, and Lord, let me tell you what a difference it makes. Once you use the battery powered sprayer, you're not going to want to use anything else. Even if you don't fill it up all the way, let's say you just put a gallon or 2 in here, having to all you got to do is mix it up and just hold the wand down, and it just continuously applies an even pressure stream while you're spraying, and it is the best. No more pumping, because when you have that handle on the side and you're sitting there pumping up and down, your arm gets really tired, especially if you got to go through a couple tanks of this. So I'm never going back again. It's going to be battery powered from here on out. And they even make battery powered little 2-gallon or 1-gallon pump sprayers. I've seen them out there. I've not used one yet, but I know they make the battery powered version of this size as well. But sometimes I won't lie, this 4 gallons, which they make a 4 and a 5-gallon backpack sprayer, 4 gallons plus the weight of that big battery and the pump and everything, this gets pretty heavy. You know, I'm 200 and something pound dude, and sometimes I'm not gonna lie, I'm like, I put this on, I'm like, oh, this is really heavy. It hurts your shoulders after a while. So if you are a smaller lady, just keep in mind that this fully with 4 gallons on your back is going to get tiresome after a while. And so sometimes what I'll do is just put 2 gallons halfway up here, and I'll just do that just because I don't want to carry 4 gallons of water on my back for, you know, multiple sessions. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about a backpack sprayer. For all your mounted orchids, you're going to need to apply your fertilizer via a spray system, because there's no pot, it's just on a piece of wood. And you want to make sure that you evenly coat the surface of the mount in the plant. You're not worried about getting it on the foliage. I mean, you're not particularly going for the foliage, but just spray the whole plants down. Let's come over here and see if we can find something mounted. Something like this cedar totem, it's got vanilla and some orchids on it. You're just going to want to just spray the whole surface, all of it, just until it runs off, all the roots are saturated, and all of this stuff. So a backpack sprayer makes it very easy to apply fertilizer to all these hanging orchids. And for the potted stuff, like I said, I just make a couple buckets and, you know, just drench the roots with the fertilizer. Let's see if I can find something that's got the slow release in it. So here you can see there's a little bit of that dynamite slow release fertilizer in here. There's some weeds too, but we're not going to look at that. But so there's your fertilizer. So if I water, some fertilizer is going into the root zone of this plant. whether it's got fertilizer in the water or not. I think that's all I got for you today. I was gonna make a video of me applying the fertilizer, but I did that yesterday, so I apologize. I ain't got nothing else to fertilize right now. But I hope you didn't get bored from all of my talking. Like I said, these are just my opinions and what I've learned and what works for me, and what works for me may not work for you. So just keep that in mind. And anytime somebody tells you that you need this product, you should do your own research. But that being said, some fertilizer is better than no fertilizer. I hear people come to the nursery, they'll tell me at work, like, oh, my orchids look great and I never fertilize them. And that's because orchids are really efficient users of the nutrients that they have available. Like I said, most of these are epiphytes, and so they naturally have to make do with very little. And so they are efficiently using what they have, and they can go years and years without needing much fertilization. But a lot of times what people don't realize is, if they're not really accustomed to looking at orchids all the time, that what happens is, as new growth emerges, the plant is removing all the nutrients from the oldest growth. The oldest growth dies off and the plant never gets much bigger. They'll still grow. Nature finds a way. But I tell people when they tell me that, they said, oh, I never fertilize my orchids and they're beautiful. Ooh, about fell in the pool. That's why you shouldn't walk around the pool and talk at the same time. But what I tell people is, if you're having all this success now without fertilizing, imagine how much nicer your plants would be if you did fertilize them. So just food for thought. And if you like this video, or if you didn't like this video, if you said, Tristan, you talk too long, you can't keep a consistent train of thought, you're all over the place, you can let me know that too. But if y'all want to hear anything else about fertilizer, or if I missed something that you think I should talk about, just let me know. Maybe we can cover it in another video. Like I said, I'm just ranting and I may have forgotten something. So without further ado, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see y'all guys in the next video. So stay tuned, guys. Thanks.